It's been a really interesting conversation so far, starting with geopolitics, talking about the finance, and now we're going to talk about the supply chains. Benjamin, if you don't mind me starting with you, Kevin Rudd was talking very broadly about geopolitics going forward. You're at the sharp end. You talk to bosses of multinationals and also smaller companies, your clients daily. What are they telling you about how the last 2 years have been for them in terms of supply chain problems?
It's been a tough 2 years, and I think globalization is evolving. Most MNCs are saying, look, I can't just be done my purchasing on just in time. I got to evolve to just in case. They're more looking at nearshoring, friendshoring. However, MNCs cannot go all the way to just in case because it's simply uneconomical. That's one. Geographically, they're saying, I need to diversify so the China plus one kicks in. But the pace of it is happening varies across sectors, across industries. Some are easier, some are less easy to do. So that will evolve. And I do think that whole notion of deglobalization cannot be over-exaggerated because the world is very interconnected.
Yes.
And then there's a third component, which I do think the last 3-4 decades, we have seen fundamentally the East manufacturing for the consumption by the West. The next decade will start to evolve towards the East manufacturing for the consumption by the East. And therefore, there will be evolving new supply chain, new corridors that commensurate this trend.
Fascinating, and we're going to explore those themes in a few minutes. But first, Ezgi, I'd love you to tell us what the last couple of years have been like for AB InBev, because you have a fascinating supply chain, and you operate in 50 countries around the world. It must be unbelievably complex, and yet you still manage to provide us with beer, which has been a thankful thing for all of us, to say the least. But what are the challenges the last 2 years been like for your company?
Yeah. I think we've all learned how to live in a fast-evolving external landscape, right? The world is complex, and we're becoming aware of that complexity and interconnectedness, which is not going to go away. So for us, a global business that is deeply rooted in nearly 50 countries around the world, where we invest in those local supply chains, local economies, we've always invested in the resilience piece, and we've learned how to balance the resilience with efficiency. And I think the other piece that comes with this for companies like ours, and hopefully we can share more of those learnings with the world as well, is how do you then, by investing in those local communities, get them ready for global markets and the new trade corridors that are going to happen? Because I think what's happening with globalization is that we're leaving people behind. And I think the more we can do globalization better, the more we're going to see local resilience and economies thriving as well.
Which is exactly what we want to kind of tackle right here with Standard Chartered. We talk about sustainability all the time, Ben, don't we? Everyone has a different opinion of what that actually means. So what does a sustainable supply chain mean to you?
Well, now, banks are in the process of capital allocation, right? So over time, banks will allocate money to those who subscribe to transition and away from those who don't and pollute. Right now, this is a learning process. You can't do this overnight. You have to bring along the suppliers, the SMEs in particular, to help them navigate and transition. So it's an element of both carrot and stick, because if you don't join the bandwagon, you will be eliminated, right? Because money will not flow to those who don't subscribe to it.
Yeah, okay, that's a very succinct point. Ezgi, I know that your company is very forward-looking when it comes to sustainability. I think you've actually got sustainability goals which you're going to hit in 2025, so you've only got 2 more years now, haven't you? Are you on track just quickly?
We are making really good progress.
Okay, well, and I know that you call yourself a global local company. So how are you making your supply chain a sustainable one?
Yeah, I think building on the point around SMEs, right? If you look at our value chain, we work with tens of thousands of farmers, smallholder farmers in the field, side by side with our economist teams, extension teams around the world. And then if you look downstream, we work with close to 5.5, 6 million retailers, many of whom are small mom and pop shops, our customers around the world. So you need to bring them along. You need to close the gaps in digital inclusion, financial inclusion, social inclusion.
So how do you do that? Give me an example.
So let's take farmers, for example, by providing them the right seed varieties that are appropriate for that climate and soil condition, by giving them inputs before the harvest season starts, educating them on the advanced economic practices and now on regenerative agricultural practices, making them more climate resilient, offering them weather data, market insights, really kind of building that transparency and investing in making sure that they're more skilled, more connected, more financially empowered. Because in many cases, these smallholder farmers don't have access to the financial products that we see, from the other bigger players in our supply chain. So for us, by investing in them, we provide opportunities for them. And I think the other big piece we need to remember here is reliable demand. By being that off-taker year after year in that community, you formalize that supply chain, you get them ready for the global markets.
Yeah, no, and also it must be a huge element of loyalty. I mean, they must want to stay with you if you're kind of looking after them so well. And Ben, it was interesting, Marisa was telling us that in the conversations of the various meeting rooms she's having in Davos, this is a big issue, like the end of the supply chain. How do you help small but also decent-sized companies, become more sustainable, whether the way they look after their people or cut their emissions? So what advice do you give in terms of trying to help companies manage that?
Yeah, it's look, all banks will have their own environmental policies, so it's about educating, guiding them what they need to do to support that. The second point I want to make is we have to leverage hard on technology, because technology will allow the traceability of transaction, which makes the whole supply chain more inclusive. Because let's say AB InBev, I'm sure we'll have tons of suppliers, and we go first tier, second tier, third tier, into very deep tier supply chain, right? So sometimes banks need to work harder on the leverage on technology to work the way through to supporting the nth degree of the layers of supply chain. These are the really MSMEs. Those are the ones that we have to support and bring along.
I'm sure technology plays a huge part, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, sometimes we forget. We talk about resilience and we forget innovation, and we shouldn't, because that's at the heart of it. And I always like to think of sustainability as a design problem, right? Sustainability is the ultimate brief for design. So, how we design our processes, our organizations, our products is going to be increasingly critical. So that innovation piece is very important. And, for us at AB InBev, as we're looking to decarbonize our own, inside our own four walls and then outside in our scope 3, we actually created a platform called Eclipse, where we invite our suppliers so that we can share our learnings in clean energy transition and what we're doing there across markets. Because again, as a global local business, you can take the learnings and best practices from one country to another. You can take the learnings of enabling policies, the regulatory backbones that are needed to enable that competitive marketplace for that transition to accelerate.
Okay, I'd like to focus on Asia, if you don't mind. Of course, that's your area, that's the kind of the region that you're in charge of. It's been fascinating being here this year. The huge presence from China, they are reopening, all the COVID rules and regulations being dropped, and yet we have this kind of, this so-called decoupling, perhaps, particularly when it comes to the technology sector. So what is your outlook, and what is your outlook for supply chains within the Asia region? Yeah,
as I said earlier, I want to build on the point of Asia becoming an ecosystem, because Asia will have the biggest rising middle-class population.
By when? It's soon, isn't it?
Well, it is happening. Depends on where they are on that curve, right? Those economies that are transitioning from, let's say, around $3,000 per capita all the way to 5,000-6,000, those are riding on that curve in terms of consumption, okay? So we're seeing India coming through, we're seeing Indonesia coming through. China's kind of past it, but still has leg to go. So if you think about the big economic engines within Asia, which is Greater China, ASEAN, and India, that consumption demand will start to kick in. And therefore, the whole supply chain would need to be wired around how do you facilitate the demand of these really 4.7 billion people. Right, and that's very, very exciting.
It is very exciting. And I know that you, AB InBev, are investing heavily still in the region. I was just reading, actually, Ezgi, you have just opened a smart green brewery. Is that right, in Wenzhou in China? You have a big investment there. Is it a region that's very important for you?
So we have many operations in China where, we're taking the learnings from around the world, investing in innovation, and even finding local innovation as well, where we're making those green transitions. And huge opportunities. I think what's really exciting across markets in Asia, China, India, et cetera, is there's a lot of appetite. The workforce is great. There's a lot of innovation, innovative thinking, and we're bringing a lot of those learnings from those markets as well to the West. And I think, many times we forget like you mentioned before, where we think that the direction of travel is one way, and it's not. It's actually very much international, and increasingly this is what we're going to see around the world as well. Global trade corridors are becoming ever more complex and more nuanced, I would say.
And is that a headache for you, or is that an opportunity?
It's an opportunity for a business like ours, right? Again, deeply rooted in those local communities.
Right.
We're investing, we're locally sourcing, and we benefit from the services that are provided in those countries, right? So the more we can invest in their well-being and economic resilience, the better. Yeah.
Talking investment, Ben, you mentioned China plus one. So just explain that and what you're
So
seeing.
fundamentally, China is the biggest, it's a factory for
Yeah,
the world,
factory
right?
for
It
the
is
world.
a
I love
factory
that.
for the
I
world.
heard that this today for the first time. Factory for
Factory
the
for
world.
the world.
And India is the pharmacy for the world, I heard.
And the office for the world. All right? So fundamentally, there's an element of concentration of manufacturing in China. The China plus one fundamental means it's not to say we leave China, but beyond China, should we be diversifying to make that supply chain more resilient? Now, that can mean MNCs going to markets like Vietnam, to Bangladesh, to India, to Indonesia, and that's where a lot of the ASEAN and South Asian markets are prime targets for that diversification destination.
So just paint a picture of what it would look like in the future in terms of trade hubs and trade corridors, particularly ones that are sustainable. What are you looking at?
I'm looking at one of the biggest corridor we're looking at is China-ASEAN.
China, Australia?
That's huge. No, China-ASEAN.
ASEAN, sorry. ASEAN.
Right, that's
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then fast forward another 5-10 years, it'll be China, India. That's a very, very big corridor. And then currently we're also seeing Japan, Korea into Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Taiwan into Vietnam. There's a huge amount of wiring that goes behind. But it's actually very, very complex, but equally, if you can navigate through that, it's very, very exciting.
You need good partnerships, don't you?
Yes, indeed.
Talking of partnerships, I just want, as we wrap up, just very quickly, trade policies from policymakers and regulation. Do you have everything you need, or is it something that you would like to see happen to make your job easier?
I mean, I would say ultimately our goal is to help shape better policy environments that are going to, create the transition and catalyze the innovation. So for us, we look at many countries around the world, and depending on the solutions that we see that are beneficial, we try and take those learnings through different industry groups, associations, memberships, and try to drive that conversation. And there's a lot of opportunities. And I would say, again, in an increasingly complex world, it's no longer, a logistics manager taking something from point A to point B. Our teams are becoming a lot more cross-functional. It's really becoming a lot more, I would say, a dynamic conversation around, how are we investing in local products, local supply chains? How are we meeting the needs of, the future consumer?
And are trade policies keeping up with the complex world, as Ezgi
It
mentioned?
needs to harmonize, it needs to digitize, it needs to enhance traceability. Ultimately, if the SMEs can trace back to big suppliers like AB InBev, then they will have more accessible financing and cheaper financing.
And just finally, I read, Ezgi, that you talk of having gritty optimism when it comes to the sustainable supply chain issue. What do you mean by that quickly?
Well, I talk about this often, and I mentioned it to Benjamin as well. This week, we heard a lot of optimism in different settings and rooms that we've been in. And I think you need to have a belief system that a better future is possible, and you can be part of helping shape and create that. And I think that's why we all gather here to try and help make that happen. So gritty optimism all the way.
Yes, indeed. And I am excited. I believe in globalization. It's good for the world. It needs to evolve. It needs to be more resilient. It needs to be more inclusive. It needs to be more sustainable.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you so much. It's been fascinating listening to you. A big round of applause, please, for Ben and Ezgi. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's been really interesting. Thank you so much.